Hey, God, what are you going to do? Habakkuk's got some questions for God. He's seeing some things that are really bad with the people around him, and he's saying, God, what are you going to do about all this wickedness? God says, I'm going to do something. I'm going to bring the Chaldeans. And so now Habakkuk's got even more questions. How are you going to bring the Chaldeans? Why would you bring them? They're worse than we are. And so Habakkuk is going to decide to camp out and just stay there in the stronghold, in the citadel, and wait to see what God's going to do. And so we're going to look at this little study, as we know as Habakkuk, in our work tonight. By the way, in your portfolio, there is a page that says, well, it says just like this, doesn't it? He's already got the answers. Boy, can I use this? It says Habakkuk overview questions. And hopefully as you watch and listen, you're going to get all the answers to at least most of those questions as we walk through. So Gerald's way ahead of you, and maybe he can help me get this thing right as we walk through some of this together this evening. You know, I don't think I have even said thank you for allowing me to come. I've just enjoyed this so very much. Cindy and I have really enjoyed it. You guys are a noisy bunch. Do you know that? It's kind of like being back in Lafayette, Indiana. You just can't get people to get quiet. You're just having such an enjoyable time visiting and just chattering. But you do get quiet because you want to honor God and respect Him. But you just seem to enjoy each other. That's just a wonderful thing. And thanks for allowing Cindy and me to enjoy it with you for just a few days. When we were here in 2009, it was just a wonderful blessing to us. And we hope in some small way we can be a blessing to you as you are to us. Can I tell you about some good people? I think you knew a guy named Tom Moody. You know, it was just a week ago Wednesday that I was talking with a recent graduate at Purdue University, and she said, oh yeah, we're in Memphis. And she said, and Brent Moody's the preacher, and we just love him. He's just doing such a great job. Isn't that a nice thing for y'all to hear? To hear about people who serve the Lord and serve the Lord with you, and now their kids are serving the Lord and sharing the good news with other people. And of course, meeting Brian down in Birmingham was such a blessing. So I'm so glad you have encouraged them. Sherry is such a delight. And so thank you for caring about people and hearing and sharing in their good work as well and being a part of that. You know, they take you with them when they go. And so thank you for blessing their lives. So, let's think about this fellow Habakkuk in this time period. This is a literary document. And some of the things that I didn't know why Mrs. Harris, Calantha Harris, she was my teacher in English, and we had to do journalism. And she said you had to ask questions like who, what, when, where, why. And we've been doing that in these studies. But you know, the most important question, though, is wherefore? Or I like to call it the so what question. You know, we can collect a lot of historical information. Well, what are we supposed to do with this? You know, usually when an author writes something, he writes it with an intention. He plans for it to change you in some way. So that's one of the things we want to do with each of the prophets is, okay, I can get the facts about the setting, I can get the political backdrop, I can get all of the dates, and I can get all of the historical markers. But so what? People who've written history have always written history with purpose. You don't just write it to record events. You plan to change minds by what you record. And so did these authors as they were writing these messages. So we want to get behind the eyeballs of people like Habakkuk and say, now God, why? How could you do this? How can you let this wickedness just keep going on all over the place? And so we're going to look at the fact that Habakkuk can be grouped with a couple of other guys because he is writing to his own people, but he also has a message for a people that's at least 600 miles away. Obadiah is writing to people who are relatives. The Edomites are descendants of Esau. And he's describing the treachery of the way they treated their cousins, the Israelites. But we also have not had opportunity to look at Nahum, who wrote about 100 years after Jonah. And although the people of Nineveh repented in Jonah's preaching, they went back to being wicked not too many years later. And God says, I'm going to bring a great flood, and I'm going to flood out Nineveh. And if you know anything about the history of how it fell in 612, it was unique that he would use that kind of terminology. And so now we're looking at a guy a little bit later, about 612 or so, down to 605, who has been saying, God, what are you going to do about this? The people I live around are wicked. There needs to be some kind of judgment brought to get us back to God. And God says, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to bring the Chaldeans. Well, that doesn't help him at all because the Chaldeans are really ruthless people. And so those are the prophets who are directed to those nations. You might want to include Jonah in that list as well. Now, this is a smaller print, I realize that. But I want you to just kind of be able to see where he is here. Here's where he fits. So his contemporaries, I think you have a question on that in your handout. His contemporaries are Zephaniah, Jeremiah, also going to be contemporary with a guy named Daniel. And so those are people who are prophesying about the same time period as Habakkuk. His name means embracer. As I was reading more about that with Jack Lewis today, he was talking about that's not really a typical Hebrew name. I had a little graphic up there that showed a mom and dad embracing their graduate. Well, that's not exactly the idea. But do you have somebody around you that just kind of comes up and they just kind of want to give you a hug? Or they know you're kind of drooped down and they'll just come and put their arm around your shoulder and say, let's go together. You know, the kind of Barnabas kind of person. Well, that's what Habakkuk is. He's one who's going to try to help other people who are hurting and frustrated and discouraged, and he's going to come alongside them and embrace them, and then God's going to embrace him as he has this message to share with others. So here's his other buddies. Here's the other guys that are writing at the same time period. Daniel may not have done any writing yet, but he's been in the same era, and he's going to be taken into captivity early on. This guy lives in the little region known as Judah. The Israelites have been divided through civil war for about 300 years now, and the northern kingdom's been taken away by the Assyrians in 722, 721, yet there's a little kingdom down in the south known as Judah that the Assyrians did not take, and yet the Babylonians are going to swoop in. So he's going to relate God's use of the Chaldeans to punish Judah. You know, sometimes we watch the evening news and man, things are bad around here. God, what are you going to do about all the graft and corruption and the murder and the bloodshed, all the bad stuff in America? Can you just imagine God says, oh, I'm going to fix it. I'm going to bring Iran. And they're going to blow you all up. and so that'll solve the problem. I'm going to have an Islamic invasion. There's going to be a jihad, and y'all are going to be gone. So you don't have to worry about the wickedness anymore. Well, how do you take that kind of message? It's like, well, wait a second. God, I don't think we're that bad. And that's kind of where Habakkuk is as he's dealing with all of this. And so he says, God, can I ask you some questions? You know, it's okay to ask God questions. We need to be respectful when we ask Him questions, but it's okay to ask God questions. And what this document mostly is Habakkuk asks a question, God gives an answer. Habakkuk asks a question, God gives an answer. And then God gives another answer. And then there's going to be a song. Chapter 3 is a song. It's a psalm, and we'll see that poetic expression there. So he's going to relate God's punishment of the Chaldeans after using them. So here he's saying, God, we're bad, but you're bringing somebody worse to punish us? Yes, but when I'm done using them, I'm going to deal with them. And I'm going to take them away completely. And so Habakkuk's got to wrestle with the justice of God and the righteousness of God and how God could be responsible for leading in those judgments of those who reject His values. So there's a verse here that I would suggest to you is somewhat key in our study. We're going to read through the text as best we can, but I'd like you to go with me right now to chapter 2 and verse 4. In chapter 2 and verse 4, there's a statement that is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. And in chapter 2 and verse 4, he is describing what's about to happen. God is going to tell Habakkuk how people are going to survive in this assault and in this invasion. I'm going to need a little help with the first couple sentences there. Clyde, do you have that? Are you having trouble too? Gerald, how about chapter 2 verse 4? Phil's already ready. Go ahead.
Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him. but the just shall live by his faith.
All right. We've got the proud, the arrogant one. His soul's not right. But who will survive? The just or the righteous shall live by his faith or faithfulness. That's the concept. So in Romans in chapter 1 in verse 17, that passage is quoted, the righteous shall live on the basis of his faith. Now let's look in Galatians chapter 3, the second time that that's stated. Galatians in chapter 3. You know, I just recently bought a large print Bible. And it's right back there in my office in Lafayette, Indiana. And I'd like to say that I don't need it, but I'm thinking that maybe I do. So you may have to help me more than I'd like to rely on this evening. In Galatians in chapter 3. Surely it's not that I'm getting older or anything like that. In Galatians chapter 3, let's read verses 10 through 14 together. 10 through 14. Now you got that electronic gadget all wired up there?
For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith, or as you said, the one who is faithful and righteous will live. But the law is not of faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith.
Thank you very much. So there are basically two systems by which a person can be justified in relationship to God. One is on the basis of law. And in order to be justified on the basis of law, all you have to do is keep it completely and perfectly. And never violate, never transgress, never go beyond the law. And then you can just walk up to God and say, you owe me salvation because I've never done anything wrong. That works really well, except that's not us. We've transgressed. We've gone beyond. We've violated. We've rebelled against God. And so all we deserve is, you broke my rules. You broke my law. You're out. But there's another system by which God decided to justify people, to declare them right, and to describe them as righteous, and that's on the basis of forgiveness. Forgiveness comes on the basis of trusting God to do what He's promised, to forgive us of what we've done. So righteous people will survive even an invasion like the Chaldeans on the basis of their faith. Their faithfulness, their reliance on God, their trusting God. Now the last time that's used in the New Testament is Hebrews 10, and we're going to look at that at the end of the lesson. So you be thinking about that. If there is an almighty God, if He has given us rules and He has demonstrated to us His love for us, and He says, my rules are for your good and for your survival, the problem is you have chosen to rebel against my rules. We're goners. We have no hope. We're without God in the world. But if that same God decided to bring Jesus to redeem us from our sins, to redeem us from the curse of the law, and would justify us on the basis of our response to the shed blood of Jesus, then we could trust God's promises, receive His forgiveness, and be blessed. So Habakkuk is going to say something in his time, 600 years before Jesus, that is a principle that has always been true. Everybody from Adam on, everybody from Noah on, had relationship with God on the basis of their faith. They trusted God. And that's what Habakkuk has to do as he sees the fierce Chaldeans coming into his land. How are we going to survive, God? Righteous people survive on the basis of their faith, on the basis of their trust in God. So that's the theme that we're going to see. And so as we walk through that, we're wanting to see that develop. And there's the passages. I think you can write those in your notes now. Romans 1, Galatians 3, and Hebrews chapter 10. You know, there are a lot of folks that get confused about that idea of justification by faith versus justification by law. There's a fellow named Robert Turner that did a good bit of work on that, Brad. It's a really good commentary on Romans, by the way. If you don't have it, I need to get it to you. And so some people who saw such an emphasis upon law and realized that they were transgressors of law got to the point where they said, there's no hope. I can't be saved. And some of those in the 1500s. One fellow, particularly Martin Luther. You may remember him in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailing up that 95 Thesis. Martin Luther was an extremely devout man who desperately wanted to know God and wanted to know the forgiveness of his sins. And he would very often go to confession. And the priest would say, look, come back when you have something really, serious to confess. But he was trying to work out his salvation on the basis of meriting or earning his salvation, and he knew he was a sinner. So he said salvation has to be on the basis of faith. He really latched on to Habakkuk too. But what he did was he said salvation has to be on the basis of faith only, without realizing that faith, according to God's definition, is a response. It is an obedient faith, as Romans 1 verse 5 would say, and chapter 16. It is when God tells me to do something, if I trust Him, I do what He says. Just like the little kid who Dad says, jump. If the kid believes, he trusts his dad, he jumps. He doesn't say, oh, I just accept you, Dad. He jumps. When God says jump, people of faith jump. And so, unfortunately, several folks have not understood that faith actually includes the response that brings about those works, not that earn salvation, but that are a demonstration of faith. All right? So as we walk through this, let's notice some things in regard to that. Let's kind of get a feel for these guys again. See, things are going on in the world. Sometimes you read the Bible and you think, well, is anything else happening in the world? Well, yeah, there's a lot of things that are going on that the Bible's not focused to tell you about. It's not a history of the world in all of that sense. So here you have all these people. You got the Shishak invasion, Tiglath-Pileser, but we're looking at Nebuchadnezzar. I don't have a pointer, so let's see, we can shadow. There we go, Nebuchadnezzar, all right? And this is a guy who comes on the scene in about 605 BC. His dad, Nabopolassar, was a powerful king. He was a rising star in Chaldea. Nebuchadnezzar is a great general, great ruler, and he swoops down and he is going to clean up on the Assyrians, what's left of them, along with the Egyptians. And then there's this big vacuum in that area known as Canaan, and so he's going to take the tribes, he's going to take Judah off into captivity. So I can't go up, but yeah, I can if I just, there you go, Babylonian captivity. That's where we are. That's 605, 597, and 586. So that's where we're looking at in time. So the Chaldeans have defeated Nineveh. That's 612. That's what Nahum said was going to happen. But then the rest of Assyria is going to collapse, and at the Battle of Carchemish, they're going to completely be destroyed. But now you've got Nebuchadnezzar coming and says, I'm going to take the people of Judah. And he takes the best. He takes the brightest, the young ones. He takes Daniel. He takes his 3 friends. And then he takes Ezekiel in 597. And then Jerusalem is destroyed in 587, 586. But Babylon too is going to fall. They're going to come up like a rocket and down like a rock. In fact, 70 years later, they will be no more. And so I want you to see Habakkuk is seeing the need for God to punish His people. But how in the world could you use somebody as cruel as these Chaldeans? The Jews that are in captivity need to know these people aren't going to get away with it. Okay? You see, when some big bully beats on you, you need some sense of, is this going to always be the way it is? You have a gnawing sense that this is not right, but you want to know God's going to deal with it. All right? And so with the book of Revelation, you've got the same thing. God, do you know what's happening to us? God, do you care? God, what are you going to do about it? Habakkuk's being told they're not going to get away with it. They're not going to get away with the murderous things that they're doing to my people. The Chaldeans will also be judged as well. In fact, can you remember the prophet who's going to be telling the people in Judah 70 years? 70 years. That's Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah 29. Same time as Habakkuk. And so the people are being told the Chaldeans are coming. The Chaldeans are going to take you into captivity, but 70 years and you get to come home. You need to know you get to come home. You need to know they're not going to get away with it. All right? It's extremely important. So, let's walk through the text. And again, I may need to call upon you to do some of the reading as well. Let's look at the first question. And I apologize for the poor eyes. Maybe could I blame that on ice cream? I don't know. I have kind of a diabetic tendency. It must be Patty's fault for fixing that delicious pie and that ice cream, something like that. So Habakkuk, it's an oracle. It's a burden. It's something that he needs to say that God has given him. And so he is the prophet. And he identifies himself as that. How long, O Lord, will I call for help? God, are you there? And God will not hear. I'm crying out violence. And yet, God, won't you save? So why do you make me see this? Why do I have to view all this wickedness? Why do I have to see all of this iniquity? And so then, help me with verse 4 if you will. Therefore, Al, can you take that for me?
All is not slack and
there.
does never go forth. For the wicked does not surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds.
Yes. All right. It's really helpful to have different translations. Everything gets turned around. It seems like the wicked people get free and righteous people suffer. And that's a theme that the psalmist will deal with in Psalm 73. Everything gets perverted. Everything gets twisted. What's the Supreme Court going to do with this one? The Supreme Court looks like don't they care? How long are we going to be able to butcher these people? And so he's seeing all this iniquity within the people who are supposed to be God's people. And he's saying, God, why don't you do something about that? So verse 5 then, God says, look, look among the nations. Observe, be astonished, wonder. Behold, I am doing something in your day. And you wouldn't believe it if I told you. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans. He said, God, why don't you do something? Well, look, Habakkuk, if I told you what I was doing, you wouldn't believe me. Okay, I'll tell you. I'm bringing the Chaldeans. And that really then sets him back. That fierce and impetuous people. And seeing how they march throughout the land. And they are extremely powerful and strong. And they're arrogant and they abuse people. And the only justice and righteousness that they have is of their own power, their own might. Might makes right is the Chaldean rule. The ones with the gold rules. And we are going to run over whoever we care to, and we will come to destroy Judah. So, Habakkuk is really reeling now with this intense judgment that's coming upon his own people. And God says, I'm doing something. I'm bringing the Chaldeans. But now Habakkuk has a second question. The second question then is, God, you're from everlasting. You're the Holy One. You can't look upon wickedness. You, O Lord, have appointed them to bring judgment on us? How could you do that? How could you use such wicked people to judge us? They're more wicked than we are. And yet God is going to allow them to come in judgment against and is going to bring about retribution for the rebellion of the people whom he had loved and chosen to be his own. So that next question continues till chapter 2 and verse 3 as God is giving an answer to Habakkuk. And Habakkuk is being told that they are indeed wicked. Judgment is sure. Judgment is not going to be escaped. And so you need to be prepared for that judgment. And the righteous person is going to live on the basis of his faith. So God's answer is judgment against Judah is sure, but it's not immediate. You need to wait for it. It's coming, but it's not here yet. And so the prophet's decision is, I'm going to wait to see what God will do. God's judgment then on Chaldea, the wicked world power, is what's going to be discussed next. And that's in chapter 2, verses 4 through 20. The wicked are drunk on power and pride and greed. But that's not going to continue forever. It looks like they are in complete power, but they are not. And so in chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, you have a series of 5 woes. See if you can spot them. The first one is the hardest one to spot. Notice there in verse 6, you'll see that first judgment coming. Woe upon those of conquest and plunder. They think they can run over everybody and kill everyone, and they have no one to answer to. And so as we see that judgment developing, we've got the lust of conquest, we've got an empire built upon cruelty and godless gain. We just run over everybody, we just take whatever we want, and we use murder to take cities, to kill, and we cruelly treat those who are conquered, and we trust in, finally, idolatry. Verses 18 through 20 of chapter 2. The trust in idolatry is a bit of sarcastic comment. Isaiah 44 does it as well. God says, idolatry makes no sense. You take a block of wood, and with part of it, you produce a fire and bake your bread on it. And with another part of a block of wood, you carve it out and you bow down and worship it. And that block of wood can't talk, it can't hear, it can't say anything. But part of it you burn up to get your supper, and the other part you bow down and worship. Now, what kind of a God is that? And so the Chaldeans worship the God of their own power. We tend to do that. Idolatry is self-worship. Idolatry is worshiping something we can make or build, design, and then we and slave to it. That's exactly what the Chaldeans did. And do you remember Daniel chapter 5 when Belshazzar was worshiping the gods of iron, wood, gold, and silver? And do you remember the golden cups that he was using? Those were from God's holy temple. And do you remember the handwriting on the wall? We still use that phrase, don't we? Your kingdom has been weighed in the balance and found wanting. And the Medes and the Persians were actually around the gates of Babylon that very night. And that very night, Belshazzar was killed. So as we think about this, we've got in chapter 3 a prayer for God's compassion. One of the great statements in this, as Habakkuk realized God is coming in judgment, and the Chaldeans are coming, and they are ruthless people, and I've got to wait for that judgment. Do you see that phrase there at the end of verse 2? God in wrath, remember mercy. Can you ever remember when you knew you deserved to be corrected by a parent? And Dad, I know you're mad, and Dad, I know I deserve it, but please, Dad, in your wrath, would you remember mercy? See, we have a loving Father who will correct us when we violate and rebel against Him. But that God is a merciful and patient God who longs for us to be returned to His good fellowship. And so, Habakkuk is waiting for God's mercy as well as the judgment that's coming upon them. God's past judgments in chapter 3, verses 3 through 15. Justin, one of the things that really impressed me in our Revelation study, and we mentioned it several times when we were on campus, is over and over when God talks about His judgments, He draws us back to His creative powers. He does that in this series too. You know, we tend to be pretty intimidated by military might. And so were the Jews. Chaldeans were ruthless. They were a blitzkrieg of fighting machine. But what God says is, you need to remember what I can do. You need to remember what I made. You need to remember how I use water. You need to remember how I use light. You need to remember how I have created, how I have separated, how I have divided. If God is not Creator, there is no reason in the world to believe in Him. If He didn't make us, believing in a God is absolute ludicrous. If there's not a God who created this and a God who has raised someone from the dead, if that's not true, we're most people to be just pitied. And so when God is arguing with Habakkuk, you got to stand there and trust me that I have more power than the Chaldean army. Was there a storm named Irene? Do you remember the effects of Irene? Only God can do that. We're in a drought in Indiana. I can take my little green hose, 3/4 inch, and I can water for a little while. But you know what? That well only goes so deep. And when that well's empty, I can't keep anything growing anymore. Only God can bring the rain. Oh, you are so blessed. I wish I could take buckets full back with me to Indiana. Only God can do that. And so when you see the greatness of God's power in what He has done, in what has been made, He says, you can trust me. Now, if He had made anything, there's no reason to trust Him. So that's a choice that each of us needs to consider. So as we think about God's work in the past and His past judgments, we can have confidence in God's salvation. God will indeed rescue. Please hear me on this. We're about to wrap this up. God rescues in different ways. You see, when Paul was in prison in 2 Timothy, and he says that I have fought a good fight, I've finished the course, I've kept the faith, and there's laid up for me this crown of righteousness. How was he going to escape what he was dealing with? The way he was going to get out of this situation was God was going to take him out of this world. You see, one of the ways that God brings deliverance to His people is by allowing them to die. Now we think about that sometimes when our dear grandmother is very old and we just wish God could take her. Be a blessing for her because she's a child of God. But you see, sometimes when righteous people are experiencing terrible suffering, one of the best things to happen is they die. And that's what you see in Ezekiel in chapter 24. That righteous people were going to suffer. They were going to lose their life when the Chaldeans came. They trust God. They're going to enjoy being with God forever. So when you start thinking about God's deliverance, it doesn't have to always be that I'm going to live and I'm going to be prosperous. Sometimes He's going to let me die and get to go be with Him. That's a deliverance. And that's what a lot of the Jews who trusted God was going to experience. They were going to die in the invasion. Some of them didn't get to go to Babylon. And so whatever comes, Habakkuk is going to wait on the Lord and he's going to trust the Lord. Now let's finish up in Hebrews chapter 10 then. Hebrews chapter 10. Do you sometimes get the feeling when you read Hebrews chapter 11 that these are superheroes? That these people never had any struggles and they just always trusted God and they were such good people that they never failed God? Well, if that's your understanding, may I invite you to go back and read about Abraham the liar. Abraham the liar in chapter 12 and chapter 20. May I remind you about Noah the drunk. May I remind you about some of the terrible things that David did. Could I remind you about Samson and some of the disasters in his life? These are all people who are listed in chapter 11. It's not that they always did everything exactly right. Sometimes they made terrible blunders when they didn't trust God. But the end of the story is, at the end of the day, they did trust God, and the righteous live on the basis of their faith and faithfulness. And so don't quit. That's the point of Hebrews. Don't go back. Don't quit. Now, I'm fearful that I'm not going to be able to read this. Brad, are you ready? Chapter 10 of Hebrews 32 through 39.
Recall to remembrance the former days, in which after you were eliminated, ye endured a great life of affliction. Partly while you were made a gazing stock both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly while you became companions of them that were so used. For ye had compassion of me, my bonds, to enjoy free and the spoiling of your goods, knowing in yourselves that ye have in heaven a better, enduring substance. Cast not away therefore your confidence, which hath great recompense of reward. For ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he that shall come will come and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith. But if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. For we are not of them who draw back into perdition, but of them that believe the saving of the soul.
We don't draw back. We don't quit. We maintain our confidence. Yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, family's going to alienate. Yes, family's going to ostracize. Yes, they're going to tell us you can't come to church with us anymore. But we're going to hold on to God, and we're going to trust God, and we're going to recognize that righteous people live on the basis of their faithfulness. That doesn't mean we're perfect people. In fact, we know our past, and we all have one. And we know the ways in which we failed God, and we know when we haven't trusted Him. But we are going to resolve to trust God, and we are going to live and stand on the principle of our faith in Jesus Christ, and therefore we will not quit. We will not shrink back. Because we have a living Savior. And so the righteous will live on the basis of their faith. That's a process though, folks. That's not something that happens overnight. Sometimes that's a long time in coming. When we lived in Europe, it would be years sometimes as you would read and study and answer questions of skeptics, because no one wants to be duped into believing something that's a colossal lie. And so the careful student is going to be questioning, is going to be skeptical, is going to be saying, well, what about this and why about this? And can I really trust? Did this thing really get written when he said it did? And we've got copies, marvelous copies of Habakkuk, even from before the time of Jesus. And so we want to carefully ask the question, did Jesus really raise from the dead? And we want to understand with Thomas the skeptic that he says, let me put my finger in the hole. And so we look to see, does God make a case for His existence and for the fact that we can trust Him? We invite you to consider it and take that journey and make that investigation. If you already are a believer in Jesus Christ, can you with Habakkuk say, I will stand, regardless of what comes, regardless of the invasions, I will stand and I will wait patiently because the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. Won't you come to the Lord as we stand and sing?